When I spoke 12 months ago at the conference in Stratford, I talked about the fact that we had a new government and a government that was trying to establish a relationship with policing. We had policing and law and order being high on their agenda. And of course, we'd had the commitment for 20,000 additional officers. And it felt like a point where we were emerging out of the period of austerity, and there was a lot positive around where we were as a service. And then, of course, what has happened in the last 12-month period is quite extraordinary in the way that it's affected us. And what I want to do is just canter through quite a large number of issues that I think are the ones that sit now as the current challenges, and some remain, and those new challenges that we face as a result of what we've been through over the intervening period. We've got a government who talk about leaning in, and we recognise what that looks like now, and what we also have now is quite a structure around how the government want to drive policing forward. So at the very top level, you've got the Crime and Justice Task Force, which is chaired by the Prime Minister and brings together government departments from around Whitehall in terms of driving towards the outcomes that the government want to see, and I'll more about those in a second. And then below that, from a very specific policing point of view, you've got the National Policing Board, chaired by the Home Secretary, with all the senior leadership of the policing sector present, and includes Paul at most of those meetings as president of the superintendents. And then 3 working groups underneath that. The Police Uplift Programme, which is driving the recruitment of the 20,000. You've then also got the Crime and Policing Performance Group, which is very much looking at operational delivery across England and Wales, and chaired by the Policing Minister, Kit Malthouse. And then lastly, the Strategic Change and Investment Board, again chaired by the Policing Minister, which is looking across the spend across policing. And that board, I think, has the potential to be really important, because as you will all know, how much is spent on policing, where it's spent, and particularly when we talk about some of the big central technology programs, there's been a concern for the service. So I think all of those boards are in their infancy, but if we can work with government to develop those, they provide us with the opportunity, I think, to structure the discussions and progression around policing and where our priorities are. And all of those based around these outcomes. And I don't think the outcomes are going to take us back to a poor place in terms of performance management. And we have, I think, convinced government that these outcomes should be high level. They should be national, so not getting down to force level. And they're over 3-4 years, the lifetime of the Parliament, achieving reductions or increases in issues that we would all be recognised as important issues. So lots going on around a new government. And of course, the operational priorities that we had a year ago still remain, and I'll talk about some of those at the end. But I still think we're facing that demand and resources, or demand versus resources equation that I spoke about before. Even with the 20,000, that is not taking us to a place where all the issues that we need to deal with, we are able to manage. Safeguarding and vulnerability remains, and we've seen slightly different aspects of that through the COVID experience, and of course, the safety of our own staff as a real operational priority. And just about the time I spoke a year ago, I'd commissioned the review into officer and staff safety. That review was completed. We couldn't publish because of COVID, but that review has been completed. And on the 2nd of September, we launched the officer and staff safety review. And that's going to be a really important thing as we carry on and go through. But let me talk about COVID. Obviously, none of us could have foreseen the impact the pandemic was going to have on society, let alone policing. But once it started to emerge in February, we were starting to think about how we would take that forward and deal with it. And then obviously, as we got into March, we ended up in the lockdown. I've taken the role, the national gold role for UK policing response to COVID, supported by the small number of people at MPCC, supported by NPOC, who've obviously got the statutory kind of coordination role. And I have to say, really great support from staff coming from the College of Policing, coming from HMIC, FRS, to allow us to manage everything that we've needed to manage over the last 6 or 7 months, and will continue to do so. Really big focus at the beginning, as you will be aware, around PPE, the provision of PPE and the guidance that we needed for the service. We were very worried at the beginning about the potential reductions in staff numbers due to people either being ill or self-isolating. And whilst we saw a little peak at the very beginning, largely due to self-isolation and other caring duties, we have had throughout, I think from a policing perspective, incredibly high levels of people at work, tiny absence rates throughout the period. And partly I think that has been because we did work really hard across the whole of the service at the very beginning to get ourselves lined up to have our own access to PPE, and after some challenges at the beginning to get the guidance out there. And I think that's been a real positive around the well-being of our staff as we've undertaken the new work that we've had to do. Very different relationship with the Home Office. We've had to work incredibly close in a way that I have never experienced. And that's been particularly around as regulations have come out, us being able to influence those regulations and then obviously provide the guidance for people when we start to actually enforce those regulations. Very, very close working relationship and managing, and I think good support from Home Office, both officials and ministers, as obviously the broader government discussion has been going on to manage what is in essence a health and an economic crisis. What's really important though is about recovery and reform, and I created a strand of work fairly early on to look at recovery and reform and look at understanding, so what has changed during the COVID pandemic. We're still in the pandemic, but what's changed in terms of what we've had to do? What lessons have we learned as we've been going through? And more importantly, what do we think it tells us about our environment going forward and the environment in which we're going to have to police? And there's a large bit of work going there. But just to work on some highlights, obviously working practices have changed dramatically. Significant numbers of people working from home, working in a different remote way, which we must look at and understand what that tells us, understand about what it tells us about how we want to operate in the future and how we have operated in the past. And a lot of that has been delivered through technology, and some things that we were finding a real challenge to move forward. We've moved forward at a rapid rate in terms of technology and how we can use technology to assist us to do what we are doing, and we need to make sure that we pull the positives out of there. And of course, partnership working. We have been locked into collectively as a service at a local level into local resilience fora, into SCGs, and at a national level, we have worked in a way that we have not done before. And of course, one of the pandemic phenomenon is that it's all government departments have been engaged and pretty much all partners. So there's lots to take away from that. And around structures and governance and how that operates at the local level, how it operates at the national level, and how the two interact has been significant learning. And of course, one of the biggest issues for me is the criminal justice system. I think if you had a really purring along, highly efficient criminal justice system, the impact of COVID-19 would have had would put a very big challenge into that system. That is not the system that we had going into this. And whilst we have to now look at the recovery phase as we catch up with the backlogs that exist across most of the court system that you will all be very aware of, and we're pushing really hard with the criminal justice system, with the MOJ, with the courts and tribunal service around that, what we must also do is reform. And we will use innovation, we will try things, we have tried things to take the system forward, and we must retain some of that when we come out the other side and not simply deal with the backlog and then try and return to normal. So lots of work going on, lots of engagement around what we need to learn and what we can do differently as a result of the pandemic and policing the pandemic, and as we continue to police it as it goes forward. But in the midst of all of that, we had the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the extraordinary international Black Lives Matter event, the phenomenon that happened thereafter. And as you will have all been doing, certainly at MPCC level, I was having conversations with chiefs. Chiefs were talking in their own force areas about what the impact of all of that meant. And I felt very quickly and very clearly that this was a moment in time for the service in terms of how we redoubled our efforts in terms of how we deal with issues of race inequality, both internally and externally. And so commissioned a piece of work which is on inclusion and race equality in policing. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about that. First big thing that became apparent, and this became apparent in other work that we've done, is we lack data. We don't understand what we know either internally or externally about our staff, about what we're doing. And then the ability to analyse that data so that us, collectively as the leadership of the service, have the opportunity to present a sensible narrative about the way that we are operating. So that's a really key point around how we pick and understand, to collect and understand the data in a consistent fashion. And then there are 3 strands of work that I have commissioned. The first strand is internal. It's about us as organisations and what it's like to be from a Black or minority ethnic group and working in our organisation. So that will look at all those issues of attraction, of recruitment, of progression, of retention, and all the issues that sit around grievance procedures and discipline procedures, and really get for us to understand what that experience is and what we need to do to make that a better experience. And we've got a lot of information, as you would understand, from all of our staff in relation to that. The second element is about the use of powers. That's the use of things like stop and search, which is very iconic for many communities, but also the use of force in policing, and our ability to understand, to manage that as best we can, to understand what is happening, and then, as I say, present a sensible narrative, a coherent narrative about why we are using our powers. And then the third limb is in relation to community engagement. And that's really trying to get at, are we as good as we think we are at community engagement and with particular communities? Are we providing our staff with the skill set to do the work that we want them to do? And I think bringing all of those together gives you a programme of activity that I think covers the range of those issues that around inclusion and race equality in policing that are absolutely critical for our legitimacy. And I did something that hasn't been done before. We had Chief Constables Council to talk about this subject, amongst others, but talk about this subject. It was virtually done because of the restrictions, and every Chief Constable or every attendee had 2 or 3 of their own members of staff from Black and minority ethnic groups in the room with them where they were. And then I invited a number of other people to come and speak, so that we really heard the voice of our own staff and some external people about their experience of policing, and policing when it really looked across to race equality issues. And it was incredible, 2 sessions over 5 hours. And I think that's driven us to the work that we're going to do. And that work is being finalised at the moment, where we will have a governance board chaired by myself and Mike Cunningham from the College of Policing. But we will also have an external scrutiny and oversight board, which will be chaired by somebody independent and consist of other independents, which we're working up what that group will look like, to really challenge us as we take this work forward. And the association have been absolutely pivotal as we've developed this through both Paul, but also through Bobby, your lead in driving. And I want this work to be stuff that is done jointly with both yourselves, with Federation, and with BPA and other groups that are interested. But it will be led and driven through MPCC and the college. So really significant piece of work as we go forward. Just quickly mention the spending review. Spending review is absolutely critical. We thought that it was going to be a 1-year rollover, but the decision has been taken to do a multi-year spending review, which will happen in the next few months and be concluded really by November time, is the current timetable. We've put a small team together between MPCC and APCC that are working up to coordinate our sector contributions into the Home Office, and we're working really closely with Home Office officials to be part of their proposal, which then ultimately will go into Treasury. Really important message is just how difficult the financial backdrop is going to be for this spending review process. Incredibly difficult backdrop. And so therefore, from a policing sector point of view, clearly the money that will come for years 2 and 3 of the 20,000 officer uplift will be a significant part of the spending review from our perspective. We're working really hard to ensure that we get the right level there to not only bring the officers in, but do all those other things around supervisory and managerial ranks that we've done from the beginning, and also police staff. But alongside that is making sure that we secure the baseline going forward, because I'm really concerned about the number of financial pressures that are going to be into all forces over the next 3 years. And so we need to be able to demonstrate what those pressures are and ensure that the settlement and the spending review comes out with a baseline that's going to allow forces to manage those, as well as exploiting the opportunity that comes from the 20,000. And then lastly, on the spending review, just want to talk very briefly about the serious and organised crime element. As you will be aware, the Mackey review was commissioned at the tail end of last year to look into how we take serious and organised crime going forward. That finished in February. Lockdown prevented that coming in and being published, but there's a lot of work going on through our national lead, Chief Constable Steve Jupp, who's our lead for serious and organised crime. We're working very closely with the Home Office, but there will be a significant element about how we take SOC forward as part of the spending review. And obviously, as we understand how that's going to go, we will cover that further. And then lastly, I just want to talk about, we've still got business as usual. We are still going to have to deal with the COVID pandemic. The pandemic is not over. We are hitting the worst weather. We're hitting the flu period. And I think we're going to see this continual move towards localized lockdowns, which all are unique in their own nature. But we need to really work very hard at a local level, work with our partners, and use all that learning that we have around the partnership, and then for us at the centre to be looking at that. We're still now back at demand levels and crime levels where we were prior to the pandemic, and that is putting real strain into forces, and government understand that, but that is a pressure when you then got to do the COVID actions over and above. But we're now back to where we more or less were, and again, as I say, really critical that as we go into the spending review, we're able to get the resource levels necessary to allow us to deal with that. Violence and drugs, you will all be very familiar with. I think we've managed to do some great work during the lockdown period where we had additional resource capability and the other crime demands on us were lower. Great inroads there, but still we face the challenge of how do we deal with the drugs trade and the violence that goes with it, particularly amongst young people. EU exit will be happening on the 31st of December, and the planning for that is starting to ramp back up. And of course, what I think that links into also is a broader point for me, which is around protest. And I think we are already starting to see, and we have already started to see, Extinction Rebellion coming out with the return of Parliament and over the bank holiday weekend that's just gone. And that's going to continue. You are going to, I think, get mixed in there, EU exit, both sides, as we move towards December, wanting to make their voice heard. And of course, I think on the basis that we're going to be going into an incredibly difficult time economically, I imagine that will start to lead to other protest activity around the state of the economy and the impact that's having on people. So I think we can anticipate quite a bit of protest coming through. Important to note the CT element here. The CT issue has not gone away. CT is still operating at substantial with significant, small but significant threat from right-wing terrorism starting to play, and we're noticing certainly some of the noise from that side in and around some of the local lockdown issues that we are seeing. The attacks, as you will know, that we have seen have been low tech, but there is no doubt an ambition for higher tech attack planning, and the digital sphere, as with all other aspects of policing, is really, really significant. At any given time at the moment, there are about 800 operations that are running within the CT world, and you will have all seen sort of 25 plots since 2017 that have been disrupted, a range of plots there. And we're now at a point where annually it's about plus 260 plus people that are being arrested, and also just under 5,000 referrals in 18-19 going into prevent. So whilst it's been, in a sense, a little bit in the background latterly, it is really important to remember that that CT threat still remains and will continue to remain. We've got, as I said, the COVID condition that we are going to carry on having to police, and I don't see that easing up significantly as we inevitably go into further lockdowns. And I think on that basis, it's really important that the relationship that we have been maintaining as the sector, and when I was here last September, I used Paul's phrase, which is the blue team, but the working relationship over the last year that I have developed with Paul and with John Actor, particularly at from the Federation, has been really positive. And we work very closely around the police uplift programme and have worked really closely around the response to the pandemic as well, and for that matter, the response to Black Lives Matter and Operation Houdan, which was run to deal with some of the challenges there. So I think we're in a positive place as the sector. I think the work that's been going on and the concentration around well-being throughout all of this and the developments that we've made there, which will form definitely part of the spending review process, I'll put us into a good place. But as the title of the presentation suggests, I think we still have some of our old challenges that will be very difficult for us to deal with over the coming year. And we also have some very new challenges that come as a result primarily of the pandemic, but also some of the offshoots from that pandemic. So a very busy time ahead for the service, a very important time when you factor in the spending review and the way that will lay out where we are for the next 3 years. So no release on the challenge, I'm afraid, but I do think that we enter into it at a point where we can be really proud of the way that the service has responded to COVID. And I think we have shown ourselves at our best, and we should be proud of that, but we need to just keep working and keep pushing to ensure that we are ultimately doing what we're there to do, which is protect the public. So it was a whistle-stop tour, but there has been an enormous amount happen over the last year, and I hope that was useful, and I look forward to taking any questions.